Hello guys, Stormy here. And I've been really curious lately. So we've been doing that hot lap challenge on my channel, right? And I've taken four cars around so far, so not that many, but it's been enough for me to get an idea of what sort of build works and what doesn't. And I've noticed a pattern with all of the cars. They're all rear-wheel drive cars, so that is one sort of caveat to this whole thing. But I've noticed the two cars that I put drag tires on were significantly faster around the Broadway Village circuit than both of the other cars. So, that being the Toyota Supra and the TVR Tuscan S, being the two fastest around the track so far, and pretty significantly faster than the Toyota 2000 GT and the Nissan 300ZX. So that made me start to wonder because the builds themselves are pretty close. The TVR and the Supra both had fairly similar power, but they had very different weight ranges, and comparably to the other cars that I've driven, not so vastly different that I'm thinking any other factor could really play into what's going on here. I'm fairly certain that what's going on is those drag tires are causing me a huge advantage around that track. So that got me thinking, and curiosity in me, it's a bad combination. When I start thinking, I start digging into this stuff, and it goes on and on forever. But this got me doing testing, and you know what? I'm glad I did because that's where this video ended up coming from. So what I needed to pick three cars for this sort of challenge that I've got going, or this idea that I had, and I knew that I needed to test three tire types right away. I wanted to test the drag tires for sure, and then I wanted to test them against the street tires because according to Forza, the lateral grip between the two types of tires are usually just about the same. Sometimes the drag tires are actually worse for lateral grip, according to the tuning statistics, than the street tires are. So that got me thinking I needed to test those two. But then I thought to myself, the drag tires have a much, much higher PI hit than the street tires do, and that's because obviously they've got better launch traction or acceleration than the street tires do. And PI to PI, usually the drag tires are closer to the sport tires than the street tires. Usually pretty significantly. It varies from car to car depending on how much wheel spin the car has and other factors that Forza throws in there that I don't really know everything, but it all plays together in the PI rating. So that got me thinking I needed to throw the sport tires in too. And if I'm going to be testing the three different types of tires, I need three different types of drive lines to compare them to as well. So I decided I would test all three of those tires and all three drive line types. So we've got a front wheel drive car, we've got a rear wheel drive car, and we've got an all wheel drive car. I wanted them all to be as similar as possible so that I could get a sort of an average idea of how the cars perform based on the parts that I put on them more than anything else. So the cars I ended up choosing were between the years 2005 and 1995, and I wanted the weights to be as close as possible. I didn't realize just how close the weights would wind up being in the end. They all wound up being just about 2,800 pounds stock, give or take, I don't know, like 50 pounds. They're really close. My initial goal was 3,000 pounds, give or take 200. So them being that much closer is even better. The reason I chose a 10-year window for the model of the car is because I wanted them to be aerodynamically fairly similar and technologically very similar so that I could really hone in on the parts that I'm putting on the cars more than the cars themselves. So what I wound up with for the challenge was for the front wheel drive car, I got the Acura Rsx, Now, as far as the Acura Rsx is concerned, I don't know a whole lot about it, especially in Forza. I've messed around with one in the past, and I never really could get a good build out of the car. I'm not so great with front-wheel drive cars generally, but this one seems to be a pretty good car to go for. It was right in that weight range, right in the same sort of ballpark for power. It was in that year range that I wanted, so it was a good choice. I chose for the rear-wheel drive car the Mazda Rx-7. Now, in terms of PI, the Rx-7 is about a class above the RSX. So in that way, they're not very similar, but about in every other way that I could see, according to the statistics, they were similar enough that I was good pairing them together. And then for the all-wheel drive car, I wound up choosing the Subaru Impreza 22B. I believe that's the 1997 version. This car, I knew for a fact, is pretty overpowered in the game in general. I know that it's one of those leaderboard cars that a lot of people tend to use, but as far as my statistics that I was wanting the cars to fit within was concerned, this was my best option. It ended up coming down to weight. I could find other cars that were all-wheel drive that were between 1995 and 2005, but I couldn't find them for roughly about 3,000 pounds, give or take that 200, except for the Subaru 22B. So that's why I wound up going with that. Okay, so for testing the cars, my plan is to build each of the cars to the top of A-Class with the respective tires for each testing segment. So we're going to start off with the street tires, bring the cars up to A-Class, then we're going to move to the sport tires. We're going to see how it affects the PI of the car, what you can and can't get away with the sport tires, and then we're going to move on to the drag tires and see sort of the same thing, how it affects the PI of the cars, what you can and can't get away with, how much weight the cars have, power after the tire change, and we're going to be testing them around 2 circuits. So we're going to have 3 cars with 3 different drive lines. We're going to be testing 3 different tire types on each of the cars, and then we're going to be testing them each around 2 different circuits. The first circuit we're going to be bringing the cars around is the Holyrood Park circuit. I chose this circuit because it's a lot more flowing. There's more high-speed sections, flat-out sections, and then it really requires a lot of high-speed grip for the cars because there are some of those really long sweeping turns that really require a lot of high-speed cornering grip, and that's generally a very good test for tires. So the second track we're going to be taking the cars to is the Broadway Village circuit. Of course, you have to expect this one. My series, my Hot Lap Challenge, is around the Broadway Village circuit, so I know it very well, and I can generally take these cars around it pretty consistently. The Broadway Village circuit is more of an acceleration-based circuit with a lot of sharper turns, not so many sweeping corners. There are a couple, but in general it's mostly 90-degree corners and acceleration zones. There aren't even a lot of long straights. There's one pretty good length straight, but it's not even that long. So as far as acceleration and tight cornering is concerned, the Broadway Village circuit is going to be our test circuit, and as far as high-speed cornering and high speeds in general, the Holyrood Park circuit is going to be the circuit for that. Alright, so what we're going to do for the first series of tests with the street tires is I'm going to give myself 3 warm-up laps per car, per track, just to get used to everything so that I've got an idea of how the cars drive, how the tracks drive. It's not such a big deal on the Broadway Village circuit because I know that track so well, but on the Holyrood Park circuit, I'm going to need that more so that I have an understanding of what I'm actually doing. Now, as far as the sport tires is going to be concerned, and the drag tires after that, I'm not going to have the 3 warm-up laps. I'm just going to have 1 warm-up lap per car per track, and then I'm going to have 3 laps after each of the warm-ups just to get my time set in. I think 3 laps is generally enough for me to get a good enough lap that I'll have an idea of what's going on, and then after that we'll be able to really compare and see what's going on. Okay, so what you're seeing for right now is the finalized builds of all 3 cars with the street tires on them. So I'm showing you this now so that you can get an idea of what's going on in terms of PI levels, performance in different areas, acceleration, handling, top speed, all that. And then we're going to compare this later on once we've put the sports tires on the cars, and then later on again after we've put the drag tires on. So just keep this in your head of how these are stacking up right now. So the first car up to bat here is the Acura Rsx. Now this is our front-wheel drive car, and with the street tires on it is, as expected, pretty hard to handle. It's really squirrely. It is hard to get out of the corners. All it wants to do is spin up those front tires, and that's even with all of the handling parts on it. This car, at this point, has as much handling as you could put on it, aside from having better tires. So it should be able to handle this course very easily, but it really doesn't. It's got some of the most power of any of the cars I've built up today. It's got 477 horsepower. I think that's some of the most power in general I've built for cars in the Hot Lap Challenge as well. And it just wants to spin up those tires. Now it did on its final lap manage a fairly respectable, I would say, time of 1 minute 13.382 seconds, which wound up being actually better than I thought this car was going to do, considering how hard it was to handle overall. So it gets a thumbs up in my book. So for our rear-wheel drive car, the Rx-7 on street tires is a pretty similar story to the Acura Rsx, in that it is very squirrely. It's not as hard to drive as the Rsx was, actually, funny enough. The Rsx just had trouble getting turned in. The Rx-7 doesn't have that problem. You can turn it in. Now, being rear-wheel drive, it does have the potential for oversteer, and it does suffer with that a little bit. Not as bad as you would think. As you can see, I didn't go with any aero parts for this car. Now, that was more so to do with PI restrictions than anything else. I did decide to forego that in order to get more power out of the car, and I think that was actually a good decision. Now, in the end, the Rx-7 did manage to finally get a time of 1 minute 13.298 seconds. And again, it was pretty respectable, very close to the RSX's time. So again, thumbs up from me. So moving on to our all-wheel drive friend, the Subaru Impreza was an absolute joy to drive like this. The street tires were more than enough for the car. It did exactly what I wanted it to do all the time. It got turned right in, it accelerated quickly. It just all around worked. And you know, I was kind of thinking that for all-wheel drive cars, the drag tires might not make so much of a difference because they've already got that traction just all the time right there with them. And this Subaru kind of just, it was kind of an example of that. Now, it did make the fastest time of all 3 of the cars, and I did expect that. I expected this one to easily be the fastest. And at the end, it managed to pull off a 1 minute 12.547, which was actually a really good time and would wind up being actually one of the better times. So this car, really good to drive, really easy to control, and I just enjoyed it. It was really nice. So heading over to the Broadway Village circuit and back to our front-wheel drive Acura Rsx, the story only continues here. It is still difficult to drive. It doesn't really want to do what you want it to. but around here I found that it's actually harder to drive because there are so many sharp turns that you're powering out of. To get the car to work the way you want it to, you have to really line it up before you put your foot down, and that doesn't exactly equate to a good lap. Now that being said, it actually put down a really good lap time of 51.513. As far as our hot lap series is concerned, that would actually put the RSX into second place. That's a very good lap from a car as difficult to control as this one, so I am more than pleased with that one, and I think this car is actually starting to impress me. So for the RX-7 around here, I don't really know what to say. It just didn't work. The car didn't like this track very much. You can see I'm currently showing its best lap, and it's only lap 3 out of 6. This wasn't even when I was fully going for it yet, but the car just did not like this track. It oversteered around corners, it understeered out of others, it just, overall, it didn't work. Now, it did manage to pull out a pretty decent time, especially for the hot lap series again, of 51.849 seconds, which around here is actually a pretty decent lap time. Again, like I said, for my hot lap series especially, I'm still pretty fresh on hot lapping around here, so a time like that is still a pretty good time, even though the car just didn't want to work around here. Now, to finish off our testing of the street tires, we've got the Subaru going around here, and this one is very much the opposite of the RX-7. The RX-7 did not like this track at all. The Subaru, on the other hand, loved this track. It went wherever you wanted it to. As soon as you put your foot down, it was just off. It hugged corners like nothing else. It just worked around here, and you saw that in the final time, because it managed to pull off a time of 50.198 seconds. In terms of my hot lapping challenge, that would easily put it into first place, by something like 8/10 of a second. This car just worked around here, and again, it was just a joy to drive. It really was just in a league of its own. So as far as the car builds are concerned, with the sport tires on, the Acura just continues to be an oddball by somehow managing to lose weight and gain power by switching to sport tires. Now admittedly, that weight that was lost was the front splitter, so there's something lost there, but for the RX-7, it lost power and gained weight. So it really did not enjoy the upgrade. I'm doing air quotes with my hands, you can't see it, but the upgrade to sport tires, it just didn't like it at all. Now the Subaru, on the other hand, it also lost power, but it lost weight at the same time. However, like the Acura, again, the weight that it lost was the front splitter. So, it kinda give or take with this one. The Subaru's already got the traction just out of corners, so my thought process is that the splitter might have been more important, but I'll let you guys see the results. So, the Acura with sport tires. Now, from initial thoughts when driving the car, it didn't feel a whole lot different. It was still pretty squirrely, it was a little less squirrely than it was, and you kinda expect that with the added lateral Gs. The loss of the front splitter, I think, took a bigger hit on the car than anything else. It didn't feel like I was getting as much cornering grip as I should have been getting. It felt, if anything, close enough to the street tires that I couldn't really pick apart the differences just by feel alone. Now, that being said, splitter or not, the final time for this run really showed a difference because it wasn't a small difference. The final time was a 1 minute 12.603, which is a huge difference from the first time. I'll show them both here. So, Acura with the sport tires, it worked. It just worked. So, the RX-7 with the sport tires, it doesn't have the same sort of problems that it did have with the street tires. It's not quite as squirrely, it doesn't like to spin up the wheels as much. It does still spin up the wheels and it does still have some trouble with oversteer. The bigger problem with the sport tires is building for the sport tires I had to lose some power, and this car was really relying on that power more than I realized. So, knowing that, and just still having a little bit of the problems with the oversteer and wheel spin, it just didn't work out as well for the RX-7 as it did for the Acura. It did come out with a final time of 1 minute 13.380 seconds. And it lost about 1/10 of a second to its previous time. So the RX-7 around Holyrood Park, not as good as with the street tires. And I gotta say, I didn't expect that. So the Subaru around Holyrood Park with the sport tires. There are a couple differences that I can pick out right away. One is that kind of contrary to having sport tires on it, it doesn't turn in as well anymore. The loss of that front splitter to get these tires on it was definitely more detrimental than helpful in this case. I also noticed the lack of power coming from the street tires to the sport tires. It just doesn't have the same get up and go that it did have. And the sport tires just not having that same launch traction that drag tires would give you, it feels more like an overall loss here than anything else. The Subaru did manage to end up with a time of 1 minute 12.893 seconds, and it just lost out a little bit from its previous time with the street tires. I think it does mostly come down to that splitter. I would like to call it margin of error, but knowing the track better, I can't say that. It was definitely down to the tires. So bringing the Acura back to the Broadway Village circuit, I see a couple things here. Now, the improvement around here is not anything like it was at the Holyrood Park circuit. I think all that extra power I got out of it from switching the tires, which is a weird thing to say, I think that really helped with those high-speed sections at the Holyrood Park circuit. Here it doesn't help so much. You just wind up spinning your tires up out of corners, and it's not such a great thing. Now, it did manage to make a pretty close time to the first time around here. It's actually not as fast. It managed a 51.598 seconds. And that's almost close enough that I want to call it margin of error, but I do notice that that extra little bit of power just causes some problems, and I am thinking that the street tires are just better for this car track combination. So taking the RX-7 back around the Broadway Village circuit, it's actually not that different an experience from the first time. It seems to be a very similar drive. It's a little bit oversteery, it likes to spin up the tires a little bit, but it is just that little bit more tame. Having less power and having the slightly grippier tires, it does just make the car a little bit more drivable. And that really helped it out. It wound up with a time of 51.501 seconds, and I want to say it's margin of error because I'm getting a little better with this car and a little better with this track. But again, this time I don't think I can call it that. I think the car is just a little bit better to drive. And even with that slightly less power, I think I could have gotten more out of it. So bringing the Subaru back to the Broadway Village circuit, this time around, again, it's just a similar story. It feels a lot like the first time, but this time the Subaru just has less power. I don't think I could have pulled a lot more out of this lap. I think I generally drove it pretty well. Not perfectly. Obviously it's not perfect. The first lap wasn't perfect either with the street tires. But, you know, I just think it feels about the same. Now in this case, I think again the loss of the front splitter and that loss of power just don't help it much. It wound up with a final time of 50.829 seconds, and that's just that much slower than the first time again. It's a little over half a second. So again, I can't really call that margin of error. I should be better at this point, but it's just a little slower. So that about takes care of the sports tires part. Now we're moving on to the builds for the drag tires. And starting off with the RSX, this car took the biggest hit. It lost a whole lot of power, and it gained some weight. It also lost pretty much every handling part available to it, except for that rear splitter and the drag tires. So this one's going to be a car to keep an eye on. Now the RX-7, it also lost power and gained weight, but not nearly to the extent of the RSX. But this car also gained the rear spoiler, so it should have more than enough traction on the back end to just keep it planted through any sort of corners. It should be good to go as it is. You'll just have to keep an eye on that power figure, as it has lost a little bit more and it was already struggling for speed. And as for the Subaru, this one's kind of funny. The PI difference from the sport tires to the drag tires was almost non-existent. It was a 1 PI difference, and all I had to do was put 1 extra pound on the car by dropping an upgrade from the flywheel. So that one essentially should be identical, except for the drag tires. So we'll have to keep an eye on these cars, and we'll just see how they do around the track. So to start off the laps for the drag tires, we've got the RSX again. Now this lap's a bit of an oddball in more than one way. You can see, for starters, we're on lap 2. I put in my best lap on lap 2 and found it hard to beat it. Now that's not because these tires make the car hard to drive, that's because they make this car so much more consistent. These tires do well more than just stop the front tires from spinning. They make it turn in sharper. These tires do more for the car than the front splitter ever did for it, like significantly. In fact, it is so much easier to drive now. You can just see the confidence in the way I'm driving it. I just throw it around the track now. The car managed to pull a 1 minute 11.362 second lap. That is the fastest lap time around this track of all of the cars, regardless of what tire or what driveline. This car, after it received the drag tires, became an absolute monster. It is not right. So I don't know what it is about the drag tires, but for some reason, they always seem to get the best lap on lap 2. I cannot explain that, but what I can explain is just how differently the RX-7 drives with the drag tires installed. Lack of power, just forget about it. Lack of power isn't a thing with these, because you don't spin the wheels anymore. Not spinning the wheels means you don't lose any of your power. This thing becomes a rocket ship off the line. There is no tire spin. The only negative I can say about this is I think between the wide tires at the back and that back spoiler, it makes it just a little bit understeery, but not anywhere near as much as you'd think. And the trade-off for not having any sort of oversteer, I think, is well worth it. This car in the end managed to pull off a 1 minute 12.145 second lap. Again, a massive improvement from the standard tires. Between street, sport, and drag, it seems pretty obvious that drag is better. So a much more standard lap for the Impreza here, starting on lap 4. Now, the difference between the drag tires, the street tires, and the sport tires on this car is a lot more subtle. I said it at the very beginning, the all-wheel drive system on this car just makes it feel like it's got that grip all the time anyways. But now I will say, in the case of this car, putting on the drag tires did fix a lot of the understeer I was feeling after getting rid of the front splitter. It's not as much of a difference as it is on the RSX. It's not even close to that kind of a difference, but there is a difference there and you can feel it. And in this car, I did manage to pull off a lap time of 1 minute 12.202 seconds. Which is, again, a big improvement. I am sure that part of that improvement is from my driving around here, just improving overall, but it is a big enough improvement that I'm definitely not going to call it margin of error in this case, and it's just better. So I hope you guys are ready for this lap, because I know I was not. The theme with this car just continues here. And these tires are ridiculous on this car. I don't know why or what happened, but this car doesn't drive like a front-wheel drive car anymore. It actually has some oversteer to it now. It almost feels like an all-wheel drive car, but it just goes around here so fast and it drives so well. It managed to pull off a 49.411 second lap. I could have never expected a lap time that fast out of this car, and I definitely didn't expect this car to be the first car I drove around here to break the 50-second mark. This car is just unreal. So here in the Rx-7 with the drag tires, around this track, it just works. Earlier, this car hated this track. With the drag tires, it loves this track. You can just put your foot down wherever you want, and the car just goes. And it just turns in, too. This car has the most understeer of any of the cars here, and it still just turns in like it has a splitter on it. This car, in the end, managed to pull off a 50.288 second lap time, which in terms of the hot lap challenge that I've been doing, would have put it in first place. These tires are crazy. They're just ridiculous. So here to finish things off with the Impreza, we've got one lap left with the drag tires to see what can happen here. Now, this car has had the least change of any of the cars here, but still, you can feel those drag tires. You can put the power down just the same as it was before, but you've got that turning in, and I feel like there's just more grip overall than the sport tires even. It's just so much faster. Now the Impreza did manage to improve on its best time around here. It pulled a 50.044 second lap, which again is an improvement. It's not as big an improvement as the others, and a big part of that is probably just down to my driving, but it is an improvement, and I'll take every little bit I can get right now. Now, just to finish this off, I wanted to say I didn't want this to be like the be-all and end-all of drag tire comparisons, and seeing the results, you must start using drag tires on every car. Obviously, that's not what I'm doing here. Now, it did vastly improve the performance of the cars that I chose on the tracks I chose, and I didn't choose anywhere near a large enough selection of tracks to get a full idea of how it performs on every track type, and not to mention weather conditions. I didn't touch anything outside of summer. Every track I drove on was in perfect conditions in clear weather when the track was warm and conditions were just right. So obviously I'm getting the best performance possible out of the tires. If you're driving in the rain, the cars might drive completely differently, and I can't say one way or the other because I didn't test it. But from what I did test, in these conditions with these cars, I can say for certain that there was an improvement. At worst, it was an improvement of 1/10 of a second, and at best, it was over 2 seconds. So, with that, I'm gonna say that I think it's definitely worth trying putting drag tires on a build. If you're building a car in A-Class and you're not quite sure you're getting everything out of it you could be, especially for front-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive cars in particular, I would definitely try out drag tires and just see what you can get out of the cars. And in any case, I'm going to end the video here. I hope you guys enjoyed it. For anyone who made it all the way to the end, thank you very much. This is going to be a really long video, and I'm very grateful for anyone who makes it all the way. I hope you guys have a nice day. I'll see you guys later.